thank you for joining this panel on emerging from the long shadow of COVID-19 at the India Policy Forum. I'm Sonalde Desai, professor of sociology at University of Maryland and a professor at NCAER. We have four amazing thinkers with very diverse background speaking on the panel today. The idea behind having people with such diverse backgrounds is that dealing with sort of a pandemic like this really requires different disciplinary approaches and for us to think a little bit holistically. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Gautam Menon is professor of biology at Ashoka University and Institute for Mathematical Sciences in Chennai. He specializes in modeling the spread of infectious diseases and has some very interesting modeling approaches to understanding the spread of the pandemic. Farzana Afridi is professor of economics at ISI and a fellow at ISA in Bonn. She works on labor market dynamics and will talk about the employment impacts of COVID-19 and how to cope with this sudden shock. Lant Pritchett needs no introduction. He is the director of RISE program at University of Oxford and professor of practice at Harvard University. Lant specializes in provoking us all into reevaluating our assumptions, and I'm hoping he will do the same for today's discussion around education. And the final panelist, Renana Jhabvala, I hope will bring us all down to a level where we can actually think about the impact of the pandemic on individuals and human beings and get away from our modeling approaches to think about what it actually means on the ground. She will speak about the scarring left behind by the pandemic and policies for addressing it. Just to give you a flavor of what the panel is supposed to look like, I have asked the speakers to speak for about 10 minutes each. The goal is to leave enough time for discussions and questions from the audience. So let me not stand between you and the wonderful treat you have and invite Gautam Menon to start off the discussion. Gautam.
Let me thank all of you for this kind invitation to speak here. And let me just describe the course of the Indian pandemic so as to set a stage for how to think about it and all of the things that we don't know yet. In the immortal words of someone who passed away recently, all the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns about the Indian pandemic. The picture that you see to your left is the number of cases registered every day. So you can see very clearly the first wave and the second wave. And the first wave peaked at a little less than 98,000 cases. The second wave went up to a little more than 410,000 cases per day. And on the right, you can see the integrated number of cases, peaking at a little bit above 30 million, around 31 million by now. And the question one could ask is how many were actually infected at the end of the first and the second wave? So we have a number here which says 31 million. That's 31 million recorded cases. But what fraction? That seems a fairly small fraction of the 1.4 billion Indian population. Is that really the right number that we should keep in mind? The only way to access the real number behind this is through a technique called the serosurveys. And serosurveys conducted at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, suggested that around 20% of India had been infected. 20% of India is a number that is certainly much larger than just the 30%, the 30 million odd that is seen here, which is even smaller at the time the first wave actually ended. And a more recent study, a relatively limited study between AIIMS and the WHO, found that about 80% of Indians, and 80% of urban Indians versus 62% odd of rural Indians, had been affected by the end of the second wave. That's a much, much larger number. So then the multiplying factor that you must take between the 31 million observed or registered cases and the actual cases, which could be anywhere around between 600 million and 800 million, is really the important number here. And certainly our own estimates for the true number of cases at the end of the first wave differ from the actual number of cases by a factor of 20. That number is probably larger now at the end of the second wave. It's important to know this because this has very definite implications for what might happen in a potential third wave. There is some level of protection that one gets from a prior infection. This is expected to last somewhere between 6 months to a year. And even this, though, is a little complicated because new variants are potentially emergent that can mess around with this by evading immunity that is granted by a prior infection or by vaccinations. So in order to really understand the implication, we really must know this number better. And the only way we can know it is through a combination of good surveys and good models. As usual, the situation over India as a whole is much more complicated. This is each state over here. And you can see that whereas most states have seen a fairly sharp end to the second wave, registering relatively small numbers of cases by now, Kerala is an outlier. Kerala numbers seem to not have come down as sharply as, for example, numbers in UP or Bihar. So Kerala and the northeast of India, and to some extent Maharashtra, are deviations from this rule that says that the second wave has more or less ended in India. But still, that isn't completely true. We're still recording around 40,000 cases per day. But that's still very far away from the 400,000 cases that we were registering at the peak of the epidemic. The second wave, as far as we know, has been driven by more transmissible variants of the virus, mainly the Delta variant, which has taken over pretty much most of India. And over here, you can see the differences between the alpha, the beta, the gamma, the delta, the whole Greek alphabet of different variants that you can see. And the original variants, if you sort of set that to be 1, the delta variant is about 2.5 times more infectious or more communicable than that original variant, which is why it really spread and took over the landscape of the virus in India completely. Now, the question here is, could there something come along that's even more transmissible than the Delta variant? There is space there. Measles is, on this sort of scale, probably a factor of 4 or 5 times that one number that you see there. And so there is space for more infectious, more communicable diseases out there. But whether this particular virus can achieve that is a different matter altogether. Here's another interesting question. How many people died at the end of the second wave? Officially, the numbers as of 13th of July is 410,816. But again, here there is a multiplier that must be applied to that number to figure out what is the real number. And this has been a very, very complex and much argued discussion. The only way, given the nature of recording of deaths, given the fact that only about 80% on average deaths are registered, and of that, only 20% of them have some sort of cause of death that is certified, you have to look to other measures. And another measure is excess deaths, which spiked in 2020, 2021. And the picture that you see to the right is an estimate of how much the difference or the multiplier between the actual number of deaths applied to COVID and the number of excess deaths, and across the states of Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, whatever you do, you seem to get fairly large estimates for undercounting, anywhere between 5 and 10. And one number that people seem to be converging on with very, very large error bars is that approximately 2.5 million people died of COVID, a far larger number than the 410,000. And this has implications for how we think about the impact of COVID in India. Certainly it shows that India has not been exceptional in its COVID experience. It's pretty much like any other country. It's been helped a little bit by the fact that Indians are on average younger than the typical European or North American population. But that's about the only silver lining in this number. This turns up in many different ways. You can look at it state-wise. You can look at the causes of death and the very large attribution of causes of death to unknown causes, which happened over the last 2 or 3 months of this particular year, really can be attributed to nothing else other than COVID deaths at this particular point. There's no reason for those months to show any significant uptick in deaths from other types of causes. Vaccinations, where are we? We're at about 380 million in India. The first dose is about 306 million. The second dose is about 74 million. But if you look at the picture to the right, you can see that the amount of people we're vaccinating per day has stagnated. Right now, it's around somewhere between 4 and 5 million vaccines, from a peak of around between 8 and 9 million vaccines per day. We're also not testing so much as we should. It's about 1.7 million tests in the last 24 hours. This number has been moving between about 1.5 to about 3.5. Still not enough to really keep track of the epidemic. Now it's certainly better. The only states which are showing test positivities in excess of 10% are the state of Kerala, some states in the northeast. Most of the rest of India are still are well below that. So that's some indication that the epidemic is under control. Most of these vaccines still remain Covishield, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine. A small, about 10% is the Covaxin, the Indian vaccine developed by Bharat Biotech. And still a very small fraction of that is the Sputnik V developed by the Russian lab. We work on epidemiological models that can be fairly complex. And the sort of questions that we like to answer is questions of how do you prioritize vaccines? Who do you give them to? Do you structure them? Do you give them to people by age? Do you prioritize comorbidities? what's the way of doing it that is best in terms of reducing one particular indicator, which is overall mortality. And the arrow shows what you would do, just vaccination strategies at a relatively low number of 0.2% vaccinations per day. This is the effect that it has on mortality, even when you account for the possibility of reinfections. So that's one area that our group works on. Another area is somewhat more intricate models, network models, for example, where you try to simulate whole communities of homes or workplaces and schools. And we've been interested in doing this really to answer questions of the nature of testing. One debate in India is what is the relative proportion of the accurate RT-PCR tests that are more expensive, which is really an economic question, and also take longer to return you an answer. It can take about 24 to even 72 hours at the peak of the Indian pandemic in Delhi, where by the time you get the time between getting your results and getting tested was actually a very long time because there was this huge backlog in the lab. So what if you compare that with a fast, rapid antigen test or the RAT test, which turns around a result in 15 minutes, but is less accurate or less sensitive, as it's technically known. What's the right trade-off to make between these? That was one question we've been trying to answer. We've been looking at schools and school reopening, as well as how to relax non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as lockdowns, depending upon where you are at different stages of the epidemic from these types of network models. The models that the sort of largest and most complex model that we've been working on together with a group, with a company called ThoughtWorks, is something called BharatSim. And BharatSim has the idea that this is what we'd like to do is to try and have an agent-based model for disease spread in the Indian population. So we'd like to simulate, well, if not 1.4 billion agents, at least somewhere between 1 and 100 million agents. A large part of this is the development of a synthetic population for India, combining multiple surveys, the IHDS, census, geographical coordinates for all villages, and then use these to understand the nature of variants, non-pharmaceutical interventions, put in people's behavior, economic decisions, etc., into agents, because agents are the most granular way of being able to model a population. And you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, this is a simulation of Bombay, and these colors represent the number of cases there as you move forward in time. Each dot on the top is a week, and you can see that we can simulate city-wide spread of a disease fairly efficiently with these methods. We can even do things like second wave, third wave, etc., as well as gauge effects of intervention. So this is an example of a simulated first wave and a second wave in which the existence of some immunity from a first wave translates into how serious the second wave is in terms of the reduction of the number of people who are symptomatic for the disease. These are all things that we can now begin to tease together, in which a lot of detailed epidemiological information goes in. So let me summarize by trying to describe to you the questions that we're all trying to answer nowadays. This is a question that we get asked repeatedly. What is the possibility of a third wave? Will there be a third wave? How serious will that third wave be? What should the pace of vaccination be? Well, certainly we're not vaccinating enough, but have we reached at some level a point where vaccine hesitancy becomes a problem, particularly in the 60 plus age group, where right now we're between 60 and 70%, but vaccinations in that age group have now gone down. What is the risk that is faced by children and young people in general in the 0 to 19 age group? Are they more at risk, or is the level of their risk the same? What happens with school reopening? And that certainly is an issue that we should be thinking about. Already children have been out of schools for the better part of a year and a half, almost 2 years. This is certainly an important question. Can modeling be used to assess the risks that attendant upon school reopening? Is there any question of seasonality? We're just entering the monsoon season across India. Are there early warning signals that we could pick up? How should we be looking, and what should we be looking for at this point? How does one prioritize vaccination? Again, an important question to answer. The last question, of course, is one that people in economics and social sciences are very aware of. Data, data, data. Where does the data sit? It sits with the government. We have been relatively unsuccessful in getting data from the government. That is a discussion that one needs to have. It's a very important discussion, because only then will modeling be able to reach its full potential, and we will be able to contribute something towards the understanding of how COVID-19 might unfold in India. So thank you very much for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gautam, this was amazing amount of data that you presented. I just want to make one link from your presentation to the prior session. There was quite a bit of a discussion around scarring, and I think we think in terms of economic scarring, but a 2.5 million deaths and 5 to 600 million people getting infected also has an amazing scarring in terms of human lives, as well as the household costs. A death of a bread earning individual has a tremendous impact on households. So we do need to think about the long-term scarring in human terms as well as in economic terms. Thank you. Farzana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sonal. Thank you for having me on the panel. So I'm going to focus on two aspects of the pandemic, which comes from the work that I've been doing. One is to look at the effect on livelihoods and the labor market, as Sonal pointed out. But I also want to address something that we've been discussing, but not overtly, which is the psychological effects of the pandemic itself. And I also want to bring into this the gender aspect in the sense of what have been the experiences of men as opposed to women, both in the labor market, as well as in terms of the psychological impacts of the pandemic so far. So, just, I think it will be echoing some of the discussion that we've had at the beginning of the evening today. But basically, when we look at the aggregate labor market impacts, so this is going from the period in 2019 to 2020, and this is data until September of 2020 from the CMIE. What we see is this big shock that occurred when the nationwide lockdown happened in March, April of 2020, and then we see a recovery, but the recovery has not been full, as we were discussing. But also to think of it from the perspective of what, regionally, which parts of the country have been affected more. And it seems that relatively the urban areas, at least in the first wave of the pandemic, in terms of employment, are relatively more adversely affected than in the rural areas. And again, when we look at it in terms of gender, then unconditional on the previous employment status, before the pandemic employment status, what we see is that men, the shock on men's employment was much higher, but there was also a recovery, but we are not getting back to the pre-pandemic levels when we look at the labor market in terms of the aggregate effects. But what I wanted to zero in on then is to look at a more micro study where we've been following the more vulnerable sections of the population. So these are primarily workers in the informal sector. And we've been following them since 2019. And we just finished with our fourth round of survey in June of 2021. So that we were conducting a survey right through the second wave, when the second wave hit, and Delhi was one of the worst affected areas in terms of the second wave. And we're looking at people who are primarily in the working age group, and this is looking at both men and women. So it's a matched husband-wife sample of couples in the 18 to 45 age group. And we're looking at 4 rounds of surveys here. So we started this study in May, July of 2019. And then we were able to luckily have successive rounds of reconnections with these households and to understand what their experiences have been, both during the wave itself, as well as post the first wave. And we've just ended with the second wave in June of 2021. So to give you some idea of what we're seeing here, which is, shows up pretty well in terms of the aggregate data as well. One of the worries that you have is what's happening to recovery. Is recovery tapering off? So we look at this shock that, when you look at the pre-pandemic levels of employment, and then there's a big decline, a much more bigger hit on employment in the first wave as a result of the very stringent lockdown. Then there is again a downturn in terms of employment levels, but the shock, as you can see, is not as much as it was between the pre-pandemic and the first wave. And that is because the lockdown and the constraints on economic activity were not as stringent as they were for the first wave itself. And what is interesting is that when we look at the women, there is a tremendous amount of research which will suggest that women's employment status tends to be counter-cyclical. And potentially what this could be suggesting, when we also look at the rural areas in another paper, is that potentially women may be joining the labor force in response to this shock of many of these, the male breadwinners either losing their work or also, of course, the loss of lives itself. And the same thing we see when we look at the earnings, which is that there is a halving of monthly earnings, which is the impact is much more negative for the male workers as opposed to the women. And again, this is not conditional on the working status. This is unconditional. Of course, conditional on working status also, the shock has been much higher for the men. And when we look at the kinds of, the occupations which have been affected more, and here I want to then point out again something that we've been discussing, which is the inequality that is, possibly exacerbated due to the pandemic, because there are certain sections of the population which have been affected much more adversely. So we're looking on the whole here at informal sector, primarily informal sector workers. But when we look at the casual labor, or those who are, employed in self-employed in petty businesses and so on, the effect on them has been much worse, both when we look at males as well as females. And then that gives us, concerns about the potential exacerbation of inequality. Now, I come to what, I think Sonal referred to, which is looking at the psychological distress. So when you look at this, and, it's interesting that we have very high levels of stress. These are self-reported, of course. We ask them questions about whether they have stress due to financial concerns, health-related, anxiety, depression, sleep-related disorders, and so on. What you see is that there is consistently high levels of psychological distress. And interestingly, this psychological distress is also higher for women than it is for men. And it has increased post the second wave, both for men as well as women. So even though when you go back to the graphs, you see that the effect of the economic effect of the second wave in terms of the fall in the earnings relative to the pre-pandemic levels has not been as high because of the lower stringency of the lockdown, and economic activities were still going on. The psychological effects continue to remain very high, and as a matter of fact have increased post-pandemic. And that points to concerns about the human capital, potential long-term issues related to productivity, the risk aversion that we've been talking about earlier in the presentation as well. So one of the things that we talked about in terms of pathways to recovery was to look at programs like social protection programs such as the MGNREGA. And also one of the things that we don't realize here is that given that at least the initial effect of the first wave impact was relatively higher in the urban areas as opposed to rural areas, which probably is not going to be true going into the second wave of the pandemic and the post-second wave. The focus of the government in terms of addressing the loss of livelihoods and the loss of incomes has been much more in the rural areas and much less in the urban areas. So we need some sort of a rebalancing there in thinking of what we need to do going ahead in terms of providing protection in social protection in urban areas as well. So, Sonal wanted us to talk about what is the possibility of a third wave happening. And what we see essentially is that there are, we have concerns about the risk of recovery tapering off. And this is going to happen if we have successive waves of infections and deaths. And so there has to be a focus on vaccination as a centerpiece of the response of the government. But unfortunately, as we've discussed, the vaccination rates have not been as high as we would want them to be, and we've been slow at takeoff. Our capacity for vaccine production is just being ramped up, so the possibility of third wave remains high. It's very highly probable. And we are worried about the fact that there are these longer term implications in terms of not just the human capital aspect, but also the fact that inequality within the country is going to widen. And there's a need for substantive cash and in-kind transfers. And I would say that the government can do much more than it has done when we think of it in terms of the portion of GDP that has gone into addressing the livelihoods that have been lost, but also in terms of a public investment stimulus that is needed, which will ultimately also lead to stimulating the domestic demand and private investment. But we can go on and discuss this later. But thank you so much for lending me your ears.
Thank you, Farzana. Perfect timing. Let me just highlight one point that Farzana made, that the two groups which have suffered the most in terms of the COVID economic consequences are the casual laborers and self-employed people. We actually have some policies, at least, that sort of recognize the need for casual laborers and income support in terms of things like NREGA. But the self-employed as a group, we really have not thought about very much. Once you lose your shop, it's very hard for you to restart it because you don't have the capital to start it. You might not have the psychological wherewithal to restart it. So in some sense, thinking about petty businesses and their losses and how one can jumpstart recovery for them might be a public policy issue that really does deserve some attention. And now let me turn it over to Lant Pritchett. Lant, please unmute yourself.
I'm going to share screen. So I want to address particularly the long shadow part. A lot of coping with the current wave of COVID is necessarily and rightly around the immediate effect of the shocks. But what I want to articulate is that there is a huge risk that the long-term learning losses for children from COVID will actually be multiples larger than the immediate losses of being out of school. So everyone's recognizing more or less that kids being out of school for a year, they've lost a year's worth of learning. The long shadow, though, is that it's perfectly plausible that losing a year's worth of learning now, if schools resume roughly on the same grade track curriculum and try and basically just put kids back into school, could be 3 to 5 times larger than the immediate losses because of a mechanism where of what we call the negative consequences of overambitious curricula, where the curricula is already too hard for the kids. So to the extent that kids are out of school, learning falls, it exacerbates the effect of the overambitious curriculum, and the cumulative effects of that can actually be much larger than the short run effects. So I'm just going to walk you through a simple model of this, and by the way, this is a case of having, in some sense, the right model in the right place at the right time. This is all work that we had done because the overambitious curricula is a chronic part of many education systems, and so we had been working for a long time on how do we model the long-run consequences of learning trajectories. And then when COVID came, we realized that this is actually a perfect application because we have a model set up precisely to, do simulations of what would happen under exactly this counterfactual, as well as, and I think Karthik mentioned this early on, a study that came out just at the right time, but on the Pakistan earthquake of 2006, showed that recovery of the households from the earthquake in nearly every way was almost immediate. After a year, nearly all the earthquake affected households are roughly back to their pre-earthquake earnings and status. But the cumulative effects of the kids affected by the earthquake were much larger than the immediate effects. They were out of school for 3 months and yet lost over a year's worth of schooling in the long run. So let me just set up and I'm just showing you equation just to be fun, meaning this is a room full of economists and people who do it. So we're just going to set up a model that basically is an equation that represents what is the learning of a given child exposed to a year's worth of instruction, where we allow for that instruction to be centered and where we allow that what the child learns depends on the relationship between what the child already knows and the level at which the instruction is centered. So this is really easy to understand. If I walked into a graduate student lecture on quantum mechanics, I would get almost nothing out of it because it would be way over my head. If I wandered into an 8th grade lecture on algebra, I would get almost nothing out of it because I kind of have mastered 8th grade algebra. And so I would learn very little. So there's, with every instructional process, there's a range of learning, and your learning is maximized when it's exactly targeted at your level. And your learning is going to tend to depreciate the further the instruction is from your existing skill level, either too hard or too easy. And so this formula just gives you the way we've modeled it is the red trapezoid in this graph is just what each child learns depending on the child's skill level. So if you're below a certain level, you learn nothing because you're just out of the range of being able to understand what's being taught inside the red trapezoid. If you're very advanced, you don't learn anything because it's all too simple for you. And then in the range of the trapezoid, sort of the more you know, the more you learn. And by the way, there's a robustness of these findings and the way we model it to a variety of shapes. We're just showing you a default shape of what we call the pedagogical production function. Then the way this model works is the orange part is just a normal distribution of student ability. And in this case, the trapezoid is centered on student ability. So this is the way you maximize learning in some sense is you center the teaching on the level of the children, and then each child, the subsequent distribution of student ability is just how much they learned in the previous year. You add it, the whole distribution of child ability shifts up, and then the PPF shifts up. So you go to 1st grade, you learn some stuff in 1st grade, you start 2nd grade. The 2nd grade teaching is then shifted up in terms of where the teaching is going on. So if you learned what you should have learned in 1st grade, then the 2nd grade curriculum is important. Now, what we mean, therefore, by an overambitious curriculum is that if the horizontal shift of the pedagogical production function, how much by which the curriculum expects the curriculum to move forward in terms of topics covered and depth and et cetera, if that's actually larger than the height of what children actually learn, then what happens is the pedagogical production function is no longer centered on true student ability. And when the pedagogical production function isn't centered on true ability, as you see, children are going to learn less because they're no longer in that mainstream of the teaching. And when children learn less, that sets off a cumulative dynamic whereby if you learn less than you should in 2nd grade, then you enter 3rd grade knowing less, which means you learn less in 3rd grade, which means by the time you're in 4th or 5th grade, it may well be you're so far behind the curriculum, you're actually at the 0 point and you're no longer learning anything in school. So what we do is we take this kind of model and we parameterize it. We say, let's put some numbers to this. So we take some numbers from PISA D countries, which are developing countries that participated in PISA. And so we anticipated Indian levels of learning. And then we say, how can we set the parameters of this so that we can replicate the actually observed distribution of learning in these countries? And what we find is that including then allowing we can therefore parameterize the degree of overambitiousness because we know how much the distribution actually shifts under a set of parameters. And then we can control sort of how much we allow the pedagogical production function to shift. So what we find is if we run simulations on a typical PISA D learning outcome, and we start the simulation with centered learning, but allow the PPF to be overambitious, what happens is and then we model dropout as children drop out of school if they're learning, we model dropout to replicate the numbers we have on dropout, but we assume dropout is endogenous, so we make the numbers on dropout match. So we assume the lowest achieving students drop out first. But what we find is that with the rates of overambitious curricula that best model the data, we find that by grade 10, 71% are out of school, which is set by factual parameters, but 13% are in school and not learning. So 13% of the kids, their learning profile from having fallen further and further behind the pedagogical production function, they might be in school, but they are at a level of skill relative to the skill at which the teaching, relative to the teaching such that they're not learning anything. And only 17% are in school and learning anything. But you see by this stage, since the curriculum has raced ahead, even of the kids in school, they're on the lower part of the learning because the curriculum's too hard for them. So we have several papers which are cited in the references at the end of the presentation, sort of laying out the reasons why we think this model has a lot of verisimilitude. We have data from India, data from other countries that show flattening of learning profiles. We have data showing endogenous dropout. The kids are more likely to drop out when they're learning less. And we show that it's very hard to, in some sense, generate the very low levels of observed learning with just assuming the PPF is high or lower across countries. Whereas once we allow both kind of differences in the total magnitude, which is potentially taught, as well as overambitiousness, it's really relatively easy to demonstrate that the very, very low levels of learning we observe are a combination of low level of learning in the PPF combined with moving the curriculum ahead too fast relative to this. Now, how does all this relate to COVID? Well, this relates to COVID because COVID is essentially as an exogenous shock to the learning levels of students. We've taken a group of students who, whatever level they were, and we've had them out of school now for 15 months, which means almost certainly, the evidence suggests, skills depreciate. It's, the net learning of school is you learn while in school, forget some when you take a break, etc. So now we want to model the shock. And so what this is just using this model with a given kind of assumption of the relationship between learning and how far kids are behind the curriculum. And in this scenario, we only model like 3 months. So kids are out of school for an incremental 3 months. In that incremental 3 months, they have a learning depreciation, but the learning depreciation on this scale, which is all scaled to represent sort of PISA points, they only lose actually 15 units of learning. So the immediate effect of being out of school for 3 months is not a huge thing. But by being out of school for 3 months, they've slipped further behind the curriculum. If they re-enter school and the curriculum continues to be taught as it had in the not taking into account to COVID, so we just go back to third grade, fourth grade curriculum as it was, then since those kids are further behind, they're confronting a curriculum that's harder relative to where they were to it, which means they learn less, which means they learn less, which means they cumulatively learn less. So just in this simple, again, parameterized model, we can see that just losing 15 units of schooling leads to a cumulative loss of 90 units of schooling because you've fallen behind. When you come back in, you're less adept, less able to take what you've got. Therefore, you learn less in that year, which means you go into the next year. So the learning loss from a negative shock actually doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear or depreciate or you recover at all. Rather, in a business as usual teaching scenario, particularly when the business as usual already involves some degree of overambitious curricular. So you see in this scenario already, they were going to learn about 66 units of learning relative to what would have been possible had the curriculum been aligned just from overambitious curriculum. But then the negative shock, even a 3-month shock in this model, produces almost 3 years. 3 months out of school produces 3 years of cumulative learning loss. So everything we know and are working on suggests that models like this have a lot of verisimilitude to them. I mean, I'm not saying we've proved this, but the experience of Pratham and Menon was talking earlier about remedial education proves that kids actually have learning deficits that can be quickly remediated, but which aren't remediated in school, because again, the curriculum is not paying attention to where they actually are. Kartik, who is on the call, has really excellent evidence from his MindSpark evaluations about the difference between actual student learning and what the curricular content looks like. So in his data in Rajasthan, the typical child in 8th grade actually only has a 4th grade mastery of curricular content as it is. So, and this dynamics is just a very serious issue. So the upshot is, when Indian children go back to school, there has to be a radically different approach, or else Indian kids are in for just nightmare scenario. You will have an entire cohort who hasn't just lost 1.5 years or 2 years of schooling, but if the attempt is made to return to the existing teaching practices at existing curricular sets and standards and existing examination and assessment protocols, it's really going to be a disaster. So upshot is schools need to reopen in a fundamentally radically different way than they have been operating in the past. I think Rukmini Banerjee, again, has been already raising the issue that there's some really simple steps you need to take when schools reopen. Each child needs to be assessed. You need to know where the kids are after having been out of school for so long. And there has to be some way of planning for how are we going to cope with the range of abilities that we actually have as children re-entering 3rd grade, 4th grade, et cetera, and how is that instruction going to happen? Now, there's an upside, which is all of this kind of needed desperately to happen within the Indian system anyway. And so if this shock leads people to take kind of chronic steps that would have been useful anyway, this will be very powerful and important. Kartik, again, is working right now, even as we speak, with some state governments on first 150 days approaches. When it is the case the kids are back to school, what do we do in the first 150 days so that things are different? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lant. Let me just add to this based on some research that my colleagues at NCAER, National Data Innovation Center, have been doing. Lant sort of started with the natural dispersion of ability within population. What COVID has done is actually just exacerbated this variance, because some kids are able to get online teaching from their schools, and some kids have just not even been able to enroll. So if you can't enroll, you can't get any materials. And our estimate is that in Delhi NCR region, about 8% of the kids, they were even managed to enroll, so didn't get any learning teaching materials. So now we are talking about a much greater dispersion of people coming into school. And then they're sort of hit with the Right to Education Act requirement that children be placed in schools which are age appropriate for them. So you might end up with 10-year-olds coming into the school, for some who are the first time entry into the school, and some who have been getting fairly good training material, online education through a variety of means. So we may need to think this even more seriously than we needed to do it in the pre-pandemic period.
Can I just come back on that? Because if you think about how this works in the model and how we think about it, already in the pre-existing situation, there was a mismatch between where teaching was and where students were. And there are two separate shocks from COVID. First, the entire distribution isn't making the progress it was. And then as Sonalde just said, the dispersion almost certainly is increasing. So kids that were at a relatively good level from relatively advanced households who could mitigate the loss are going to stay where they are, and the losses are going to be longer and worse for the lower tail. All three of those things together is just perfect storm of nightmare scenario where business as usual is really going to condemn particularly the less advantaged of an entire cohort to just even worse human capital outcomes than. And again, this isn't just that they were out of school. This is going to accumulate. This is going to get worse over time if we go back to business as usual. Sorry, but Sonalde, you're exactly right. There's also the dispersion effect.
Thank you, Lant. And let me turn to Renana to add to this discussion of the perfect storm and perhaps way of thinking about how do we come out of it.
Thank you so much, Sona. And I am going to go back in a way to build on what Farzana said and talk about the informal economy and our experience with the women in the informal economy particularly. And it's a very dismal picture. So as I said, Farzana has presented certain figures. We've been doing studies with our members. We have about 1.9 million members all over the country. And of course, we couldn't reach every one of them, but we have been doing studies every 6 months or so. And the last one we did right in the middle of the lockdown, of the second wave. I'm not going to present figures here, actually. Just to tell you that certain trades in the informal economy have been very badly hit. Farzana told us casual workers. Among the women, for example, the domestic workers who are casual workers have been hit not only because of lockdowns, but also because of the fear of COVID in the middle class households. Street vendors, interestingly, are very badly hit. And because street vendor markets have not even today opened up, even though malls and shops have, those involved in certain types of manufacturing like food go back to work much quicker. Those involved in manufacturing textiles, leather, like rural areas, weavers, home-based workers of all kinds in textiles are still not going back to work. There's very little work there. And you'd be interested to know, even though farmers are better off in the rural areas, women farmers are disadvantaged, especially during the lockdowns and the slowdowns, because they use public transport to carry their goods, whereas males generally have their own kind of transport. So I think in two ways, the informal economy in general has been very badly hit, and women in particular. Sonal mentioned the self-employed, and I want to take it further. According to an NSS figure, there are like 6 crore what would be called nano or micro entrepreneur enterprises in India, very small, of which 20% are women. And what we have found is that these very small enterprises, whether they're street vendors or weavers, have almost completely lost their capital. So they've used their capital basically for food or for daily expenses. We had a different, from Farzana, we had sort of a different finding that women are losing, have less employment than men when they go back to work, both less earnings as well as less employment. We also found that in this particular lockdown, 55% had to take loans just for daily expenses, whereas last year it was only less than 18%. And almost everybody, nearly 80% of people, have changed their diets. So they're really taking much less nutritious food and they're also taking less food. Since there have been so many studies, I didn't want to talk too much about that, except to say it's a very dismal picture. I'd like to say a little bit about what we found was useful during the lockdown and coming out of the lockdown in the first and second phase. The first lockdown suddenly came. There was no real, the food distribution, the ration shops and all, it took a couple of months or a month and a half really for it to really start working. And we found that there was very, very widespread actual hunger. There was a cohort of households where there was no food basically. And so I think, and this was not only SEWA, but almost every organization I know was just distributing food. And we went to about 3 lakh families we managed to reach. And slowly the systems were put into place. There is still this issue of those who have ration cards and those who don't have ration cards, and that needs to be sorted out. The second important thing we saw was that the heroes during the lockdown are the local leaders. In SEWA, that translate to what we call agevans, that is women who have been trained or who have an internal capacity to lead. And they supported the weaker members in society by linking them to governments, linking them to organizations. They also brought a lot of messages. In the first lockdown, there was real confusion about what to do during COVID, or what is going on, what kind of health things you should observe, what kind of cleanliness and so on. And in the second, we found very, very high vaccine hesitancy. I think a study we did found that only 17%, and this I think must have been in March, 17% of women said that they would take a vaccine. It's gone up, and partly it's gone up because government is telling people that that the vaccine is going to be, the vaccine certificate is going to be like the Aadhaar card. So if you don't have it, you'll lose a lot of benefits. So people are now going for vaccines. And the vaccine hesitancy is going down, but it's very high, not just above 60s, but overall. So that's another thing that the local community members learned and taught. The third thing that we found them very good at, and I think this is something that's become very important, is digital communication. So most of the informal economy families, and especially the women, were not used to getting any kind of communication except phone calls through digital means, through their smartphones. And many of them, and we have counted about 4 lakhs in our community, who have learned to do WhatsApp, understand SMSs, and take and give digital messages. So I think that digital literacy has gone up, but it's a very, very important part during such lockdowns. Another thing that we found was successful was wherever they were in any kind of collective or any kind of organized in any way, they were able to get access to government schemes much easier, also access to loans. And the other two things is, as we came out of this, there was a real demand for loans because, as I said, the capital was finished, and especially the self-employed needed capital. And yet one more thing that we did find, and that counts in the digital literacy part, is that digital marketing, they learned digital marketing, especially the self-employed, as I was saying, those who were involved in textiles in any way, whether making garments or weavers or embroidery workers, even those who were making shoes, they lost their markets. And we helped them to link up digitally. I mean, they were not able to link up with sophisticated marketing channels like Amazon, but they were able to reach out to individual customers digitally and be able to sell that way. And so that's a whole different area that needs to be extended to such small micro entrepreneurs, micro enterprises, which they don't have now, because the existing ones really are not reaching out to these type of entrepreneurs for reasons that I won't go into now, but there needs to be some kind of link between digital marketing and these very small entrepreneurs. There's this question about third wave. Now, I have no knowledge, and we don't know when the third will come, how intense it will be, But what we do know is that the way that governments have learned to react to waves or to infections is lockdowns and slowdowns. So what we do know is that we are going to face some more lockdowns. But we don't know, again, as I said, how much health will be involved, but we do know that the economy is going to, again, go down, and especially the economy for the informal workers. We do know that the incomes are going to decrease again. There'll be a dip. We do know that there will be food shortages in their homes. There won't be overall food shortages, but they won't be able to buy it. And so what are some of the things that need to be done to prepare, and what kind of government support is needed, which I did hear somebody say how much the Indian government has done, which I beg to differ. As I said, a few things before I get to the support that I think the government should be doing. Digital awareness is very important. And again, one sad thing that has happened, we found that there's a decrease in smartphones. When we did it in last year, when we did the survey last year, we found about 31% of the families, rural, urban, did not have smartphones. 24% did not have smartphones, and now it's 31%. So it's gone down. And part of the reason is people either have to sell the smartphones, or they got spoiled, or they just don't get a new SIM because of, that's where they save. The other thing I think that is important is the help to market, because as we know, the digital market has just hugely increased. But these people are left out. So there's that inequality due to the digital marketing. And we've been an advocate for street vendors. As I said, as the lockdowns open, shops open first, malls open second, and street vendor markets are still not open. We can have well-organized street vendor markets. We need that anyway. And we think that that is something that should be done. And finally, especially for the rural areas and the women, they should be allowed to travel during the time, especially for the women farmers. They should be allowed to travel to the shops and markets on public transport. This time, public transport did not completely shut down, and nor will it be shut down next time. But people who don't have identity cards or curfew passes are not allowed to go. And women usually have no identity cards showing that they're employed somewhere. So this has been a big problem, that if you don't have an identity card showing that you're employed somewhere or that you have your own business, then you are not allowed onto public transport. As far as government is concerned, we have been an advocate of cash transfers. We found that wherever there was cash transfers, for example, there are these big construction workers funds, and because they exist, the construction workers have been getting cash transfers. And if you remember, in the first lockdown, a small cash transfer was given to people who had the Jan Dhan account, women who had the Jan Dhan account. And that was extremely helpful because, because there was no income, and the next round there will still not be income. The second thing is the food that has been given out. Now, I think ration shops are operating as always. It's not free anymore. But both for ration card holders and non-ration card holders, at least during these lockdowns and slowdowns, it needs to be made either very subsidized or free. And thirdly, going back to the micro-entrepreneurs, self-employed question, as I said, they've lost capital. But there is no system of getting capital to them, because the banks are not giving out loans, as we know, to very, very small, like the street vendors or a small shop or a weaver or a home-based worker. The microfinance system gives very small loans, which are usually used for consumption. So there is actually, and it's not just for the during COVID, but there is a missing piece in the finance system where capital to very small enterprises, and as I mentioned before, there are about 6 crores of them. There's no method, there's no system of financing these very small enterprises. And that needs to be built up in general, but especially during this time. So that's more or less what I had to say. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to talk about more.
Thank you, Renana. This is an amazing presentation, and I was particularly struck by the silver lining in this epidemic for India has been the way in which the civil society has responded. And your discussion just brings home how much potential there is in India for civil society to sort of respond to some of these emergencies, particularly at a very local and micro level. Okay. First thing I want to do is thank all of our panelists and also ask the people in the audience to put their questions or comments in the chat box, and I'll take them one by one and include as many as possible. I particularly want to draw people's attention to an interesting question that my colleague Reem Ashraf at NCAER posed about how do we reopen the schools. And that seems to be a question to me which sort of cuts across every single presenter, including the co-editor for the volume, Karthik Muralidharan, who has been working on this topic. So let me just start with Gautam. Gautam, under what conditions can we reopen the school? Who can we reopen it for? Is there anything that epidemiological models give us as a guidance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we understand now that children can be infected as much as adults can. That's what all of the surveys seem to show. They seem to be a little less effective at transmitting the infection to other people. So it's slightly protected from that point of view. The adverse effects following an infection are much, much less for children. I mean, it really goes up very steeply as a function of age. If you're 80 plus or 70 plus, you're really much worse off if you're infected than if you were 20 plus or 10 plus. So my concern would be more of the fact that because children can transfer the infection to other people, they can infect other people, even though they may suffer no adverse concerns themselves. Unless if you have multi-generational households with grandparents and their grandparents are certainly much more at risk than the children are. So if you have children coming in and out of school, contracting the infection, they're then going back home and infecting people, elderly people inside the house, that would be a cause for much worry. I think we did our vaccination program absolutely correctly in the beginning. We started off age prioritization, we did the 60 plus, we did the 45 plus, but without finishing those, taking it to their logical conclusion, we then started with the 18 pluses, which probably was a mistake. We should have done a better job in ensuring that elderly people were properly immunized before we got to the younger people. In my opinion, right now, I don't think there's any epidemiological argument against opening schools in India, certainly. Already we're seeing a large background of people, 70%, 80% plus, who've been infected. We're moving slow on vaccination, but hopefully in the next 2 to 3 months, we'll move a little faster on that. I think we could go back slowly. We will see an uptick in infections when that happens, but I don't think it will be prolonged, and I don't think it will build up into a third wave, as far as we can see from modeling.
Great point. Let me just turn to Farzana and ask her. So Farzana, how do you see sort of this reopening of schools in the context of women's employment research that you have been doing? You're muted, Farzana.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. And women particularly have been very adversely affected because the children are at home, which means that, they have to balance both work for those who are working, as well as balance their home production, concerns as well. And that has become particularly difficult, of course, which has meant that a lot of women who would have ordinarily been in the labor force would probably, be on the verge of leaving the labor force or shifting to kinds of work which allows them to have more flexibility. They could be taking up jobs which have lower pay than ordinarily would be the case. And so the effect on women definitely is much, much more adverse than it is on men, given the gendered, distribution of time at home that we've had. Typically in India. But I think I just wanted to add to the point that Professor Menon made, which is, and also, of course, what Lant was saying, that, you have this depreciation in learning. The longer you keep the schools closed, the faster and the longer would be the loss of learning. So I'm kind of puzzled by why the government has not thought of teachers, for instance, as frontline workers also. Because one of the concerns would be, as Professor Menon pointed out, is that teachers would be worried about getting infected because children can be carriers of the infection. And in many countries, particularly in the US, you look at a lot of developed countries, teachers have been thought of as frontline workers, and they have been vaccinated along with, let's say, doctors and other healthcare providers. And I wonder why we don't have that in the policy discourse and why we are not pushing that. That's number one. The other thing is when we talk about the nutrition perspective, so we have a ton of evidence now which says that school meals, ICDS programs are integral completely, to poverty alleviation, to enrollment, to attendance. And unfortunately, at least in the first wave, when there was a complete shutdown of schools, all these programs also shut down. And that has implications not just for learning, but it also has implications for health. It has implications for women's labor force participation because these children were earlier going to ICDS centers. They were spending some time there, which allows women, to work in the fields, in rural areas in particular. So given, with some amount of social distancing, given that a lot of these schools, at least the smaller schools, not the public health schools, the ones which are in the hamlets, for instance, you can have staggered rolling in of students coming in at different times in the day and, be able to support the program and to be able to continue the program. So I think it's very, very critical to get the school started. We need to have a strategy to open this up, and there needs to be a very, very strong policy discourse and pressure, from civil society, from teachers and practitioners in the education sector for the government to respond. And I feel that the government is not responding to this at all.
I think Farzana makes a great point of thinking of teachers as frontline workers, and a large proportion of teachers are women. I was wondering, Renana, do you have any perspective on this sort of thinking about women, workers, midday meals, and so on?
Yeah, I am glad you made the midday meal ICDS point, because though I must say that even though ICDS centers are closed in many places, they're still distributing food. But the midday meal school scheme has completely stopped because the schools are closed. So as what I had earlier pointed out, about nutrition and people eating less food, that could be elevated if the midday meal schemes and if the schools reopened. But I also want to say that this school closure has really made the inequality between the poor and the middle class and the better off, it made it much, much worse. In any case, the schools that the poor people would go to were obviously not as good as those that middle class did. But very few of our members, for example, except for those children who are, say, in the 9th, 10th, 11th class. But below that, there's almost no internet teaching. And even when there is internet teaching, because the smartphone is not with the child, there's only one smartphone if there is a smartphone, then the child really doesn't get any teaching at all. So it has really made the inequality much worse. We've also seen that children who were put into whatever private schools were possible are now, they'll never be put back in those private schools. And we've got some anecdotal evidence that girls are being married off below age because, there's nothing else to do with them. And the parents are now worried because she's never going to go back to school anyway. And how are we going to support her? So they are getting them married off very early. So I do feel this importance of opening the schools as soon as possible. I don't know why everything else has opened, but not the schools. I mean, government offices are open and other offices are open and construction sites are open. And, the infection can be carried by the construction workers and the government employees just as much as they can by the children. So I just think keeping these schools shut is going to make inequality really, really bad.
So Karthik, you've been doing some work in this area. What do you think? What are good strategies for moving forward?
Yeah, no, I think, thank you so much for the panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion, and apologies that I'll take a little bit more time than normal because my work is so centrally, related to this area that I just feel that, there's a few key things I do want to share. I think one is reinforcing what Lant said. Many of you have seen this, but again, for those of you who have not, I can never get enough of sharing this one picture, right? Which I really... this comes from the work in Rajasthan we've been doing that Lant was talking about. And remember, this is pre-pandemic, right? So the left-hand side picture, so this is kind of showing you just how much so the x-axis is the grade in which students are enrolled in. The y-axis tells you what is the true learning level. So if children were making progress as per the curricular standards, they should be on this blue line. Now, in practice, the rate of progress is about half of what is in the curriculum. So the average 8th standard kid is at about a 4th grade level. But I think what's even more important than this is just the staggering variation within a given grade, right? So what this picture is showing you is that in a typical 8th standard class, there are kids at a 2nd grade level, 3rd grade level, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, right? And so this reflects this combination of a no detention policy where children are being kind of moved up regardless of their levels of learning, and this overambitious curriculum that, Lant has talked about, I have talked about, and, in many ways, Lant conceptually had this picture back in 2004 when I was a PhD student. And, one of my goals as a researcher was to flesh it out with real data, and so this has been one of those aha moments where these conjectures are fully then backed out in the data. So I think this is, just to highlight the scale of this problem, right? This is the situation even before the pandemic. And if anything, things are just going to be much, much worse. And Lant provided a very nice framework for thinking about why the long-term costs may be way more than that loss of learning for just 3 months, because the gap between where kids are in the curriculum is going to be even higher. Now, the second reason I'm putting this picture up is to, I think, attempt to answer, I think, Farzana's question, even Renana's question in terms of how we have approached a policy to schools, right? I think what this picture reflects, and this is again something Lant has talked about and I have talked about many, many times, is that what this picture reflects is the truth of the Indian education system, is that we have never been an education system, right? What we fundamentally are is a filtration system, where the way the system works is to set exam after exam after exam to identify who is smart, as opposed to focus on teaching kids at all parts of the distribution. And so what this is telling you is, in a way, our policy response to COVID only reinforces this kind of mindset, right? Because we focus on the CBSE exams because the filtration part of the system needs to function. So, padhai to ghar pe ho jayega, padhai to apne aap ho jayega. But exam is something that the government has to run. Okay, so we focus a lot on the exam system, but not as much in the schools, right? And I think the response really accentuates this mindset shift that we need in Indian education, which is what the NEP tries to do, right? I mean, so I did a lot of work providing inputs to the NEP, and I think, this is a picture which I've kind of highlighted there before in the past, which is the fundamental challenge for the Indian education system is how do you move, because the problem is the global perception of Indian education is we have a fantastic education system, right? We produce the CEOs of Microsoft, of Google, of IBM, of all the top companies. Everybody thinks Indian education must be doing something great, but what you realize is at its core, if you select the top 0.01% of a billion-person distribution, those kids will do fantastic things regardless of whether you're teaching them anything, right? So, and it just reinforces the fact that the core of the Indian education system has been built around filtration and selection. And what we need is to move into a developmental paradigm where regardless of where you are you being, made better than where you were yesterday? Now, the irony in all of this is the NEP gets it, and the NEP actually has a lot of good language on this. And that the tragedy is that the NEP has shown up at a time when the schools are actually closed. And so the time of the policy recognition is then meeting this ground reality where things are going to get much worse. I think the final point in terms of our policy response is, I think this is a case where the health education trade-off is very, very different at different parts of the socioeconomic distribution, right? So at the higher end, you might think that if you have access to devices and educated parents, then you're willing to kind of keep the kids at home because the perception of the health risk is much higher. And the opportunity cost in education is not that high when you have educated parents and technology. But that trade-off is very, very different when you go further down the SES distribution. And so I think, again, it reflects the fact that our policy-making class, for the most part, and not just them, right? I mean, the discourse is so elite-driven that even if you had a policymaker who's willing to take a chance and saying we need to open the schools, he's going to be subject to criticism from activists saying, oh, kids are going to get infected. So you can't win either way, right? And I think that's what makes this so difficult. And so it's not just the kind of elite bubble, but also the genuine asymmetric risk reward, right? You open up schools, infections go up, then people can criticize you. You close the schools, you don't see the learning loss for so many years down the line, right? I mean, and so I think that's why this is one of the most vexing policy issues, right? I think, my colleague Emily Oster in the US has done work on this, arguing schools should be open, and she's been criticized left, right, and center, right? So it's not easy at all. And I think the mindset shift we need is almost like saying when you're making decisions in a wartime, there are going to be casualties one way or the other, and it requires kind of really principled data-based decision making that's then communicated to the public and saying, here are the risks, and we have to take these considered risks in the broader interest. But it's a very hard problem, right? So even with the best of evidence, it's a politically very, very hard problem. So I think, that's what I want to say on education.
Great, Karthik, really appreciate that comment. I want to give last word on this topic to Lant. And after that, turn to some of the comments around micro entrepreneurs and what can be done to support them. So, Lant, last words on this topic.
So, I really don't have anything to say about when schools should be started because that's an epidemiological decision. But how they restart is really, I think everybody involved in education should be spending 23 hours of every day worrying about what you do when you reopen, because the logistics of the scale of the Indian education system are just overwhelming. And, the temptation, the difficulty is you have to have instructions on which teachers can act. What are they supposed to do? I'm a third grade teacher. I show up, I have these kids assigned in my class. What am I going to do now? And Yamini Iyer has done this very interesting study of the Delhi government just trying to reform grades 5 and 6 just in Delhi. And it's a system that's like this giant container ship on the ocean. It's got enormous momentum. And so I think if you don't have some crisis mentality of here's what we're going to do in the first 100 days, and it's going to be radically different. And we've got to, by the time school's open, we have to be able to tell in concrete terms, every teacher in every classroom, here is what you are going to do in order to reintegrate kids into learning in the schools. Without that, reopening the schools too soon isn't going to help that much anyway. If we just reopen the schools and like you were supposed to be in fourth grade because you're 10 years old, you were in fourth grade. And what does the teacher have? The teacher has the curricular materials they have the instruction they have the anticipation of the selection-driven assessment system. So I guess my point is, I think there needs to be more urgency around what's going to happen in the first 150 days schools are open. Whenever that happens, and without that happening at a scale commensurate with the Indian education system, which is, just tens and tens and millions of students, millions of teachers, I worry that, the pressure for this to be business as usual, that, okay, fourth grade's reopened, here's the fourth grade textbook, let's, we're back to business as usual. And that is just going to be a disaster. It's going to be a train wreck, and it's going to affect kids' lives, not this year or next year, but for the rest of their life. They will have just missed out on key learning opportunities. So it's how as much as when.
Lant, actually, I would like to add one more thing before even your 150 days. The work that NCER researchers have been doing is showing actually a lot of difficulty in just getting enrolled during this particular period. So if nothing else, even before the schools open, let's start at least an enrollment drive and make sure that everybody is enrolled so that the kids can show up on the first day of school without having to bring in, proof of residence and proof of ID and all that sort of stuff. Turning to some of the other questions in the chat box, Augustine Balraj has a very interesting question, which is, what do we do to support the small entrepreneurs and micro entrepreneurs? See, India is a country of micro entrepreneurs. A few tailoring shops close, some other tailoring shops will open. The problem is that the people who had started the original shop and lost their investment are going to find it very hard to come back to it. So what do we do to support micro entrepreneurs during periodic shutdown, which I think we are going to be dealing with, and also to deal with sort of long-term scarring? And I'd like to start with Farzana there.
I wasn't expecting you to ask me that question, and I thought Renana will answer that. But there have been, as far as I can remember, I was going back to the budget last year, the government came up with a lot of these policies which were going to make it easy to get small loans from banks, precisely for micro enterprises. But the question there really is how easy it is really for a person to get an easy loan, right? There are tons of paperwork. There is a lot of bureaucracy that you have to, jump loops through and so on to get the finances going. And and as you correctly point out, the probability that they'll be able to get capital infused into their business is probably very low, because there are a lot of costs associated with getting that loan, not just the cost of getting the loan itself. Even if it was free and you have to, don't have to repay it immediately, and there is a low interest rates and so on. So in the short term, at least, as I was pointing out, we do need, and as Renana pointed out, both cash transfers as well as in-kind transfers to support just the daily, day-to-day lives of these people, while they are trying to go about trying to, get capital back into their business. And to be able to provide them in employment in the short run through employment guarantee programs, for instance. So Jean had this proposal where he was talking about urban Manrega, just like you've had, we've had this relatively successful, or rather rural Manrega has sort of saved the day during COVID-19. But we don't have such employment guarantees in urban areas. So, or we think of fiscal stimulus in the sense of big public investments, public infrastructure investments in urban areas, and which is anyway required. So these are short term, of course, and the government is trying to get credit to these micro entrepreneurs. I don't think we have enough research, and maybe Renana can, from her field experience, shed some light on how easy it is or difficult for micro entrepreneurs to access this credit. My understanding would be that it would be relatively difficult, and whether civil society can play a role here in easing access to cheap credit, given the proposals that the government had last year.
Renana?
Yeah, so I had been talking about that earlier. I would say three things: capital, market, and transport, for all types of micro entrepreneurs. Capital, of course, is one of the most important. And, loans were announced for MSMEs, medium and small enterprises, but micro too. But in fact, it's almost impossible for a real micro enterprise who has never taken a loan before from the bank to get a loan, whether it's in COVID or not. There was one scheme, somebody raised that question, which is called the SEWA scheme. And that was a 10,000 rupee loan to street vendors. And the process was very complicated, but many street vendors did get that loan, not because they were able to go through a complicated process, but because the government took it upon itself to insist that the banks give out these loans. So the banks had more or less loan melas. At the same time, in order to prove that they were actual street vendors, the municipalities were pressurized to have, municipal melas. And it was only because of that the SEWA loans actually went out, and they were quite useful, though they were rather small. It was only 10,000 rupees, but once they get into the banking system, they can then increase the amount. So I think one would take SEWA as a model, but make a much simpler process for it. Market, I'd like to say, I've already said well, the other thing I'd like to say is this is emergency stuff. But as I mentioned before, there is a missing finance system. And the missing finance system is capital or loans to micro enterprises. Because the way that the banks and that same, even NABARD and SIDBI operate, they require the micro enterprises to have certain types of financing, accounting systems, which they don't have. One needs to examine what type of accounting system they have, and then make your loans fit that accounting system, which was what was done for microfinance. And that needs to be done for micro entrepreneurs. There's a big missing middle there. Markets, as I said, there needs to be, I don't have a method in which that can be done, but linking them to digital markets. And the Amazons and Flipkarts are just not going to take them in. There are many reasons for that. So again, can you have a different type of digital market? Street vendors, I come back to. The markets for street vendors are closed, but the street vendors themselves provide markets for many micro entrepreneurs. So, that really needs to be worked out. How do you have organized street vendor markets? And finally, transport. Micro entrepreneurs need to transport raw materials and finished products. And with the lockdowns only allowing certain types of people to move around, these people are really suffering. So I would say these three things need to be attended.
Thank you, Renana. And I know that we have a lot of people with experience in some of these areas who would be great for commenting. And Karthik has great ideas on some of these topics, but I'm going to request him to use the time that he would have tomorrow in his session, where I think some of these themes
actually,
would be
Sonalde, so what happened was, there's just one intervention I want to make to connect the last session with this one, because I think the chair there didn't see the hands up from the panelists, right? And I think, so if I can just take 30 seconds, right? Because so what Mr. Pai kind of said was the one point I disagreed, right? I think there is this view right now that because Jan Dhan account balances are building up, that cash transfers are not going to have an impact, right? And I think there is a huge difference between one-off transfers and predictable transfers, right? So the problem with the way the government is doing cash transfers is someday some politician will announce a largesse and something shows up in your account. And given that you have no idea what the future holds, you are going to have precautionary savings motive and save that, right? But the key is, if you have a source of income, even if it is very small, that is predictable, that changes, that changes the downstream, and that would help, we have evidence now on the multipliers of that. So that would connect a lot of the streams here.
Thanks.
Okay.
I'm going to give last word to Gautam Menon, and then not stand between the dinner and, all the participants. So Gautam, the last word.
I want to make a point that's epidemiological, but also touches what Ms. Jhabvala said. That is, when you choose how to unlock down, you make sure that the malls are open first and the big shops, and the street vendors are much later in your course of action. That's completely the wrong order, and we've been saying this many times. It's not evidence-based at all. You should have had people out. You should have opened out public parks long before you did anything close. Street vendors are most safe because they operate in open air. So we've been hitting our heads, making this point many times. This is where the importance of evidence and policy comes in, which is unfortunately being ignored at multiple points. Sorry.
Thank you, Gautam. I particularly appreciate this comment because this is the benefit of having a multidisciplinary approach to some of these issues. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate the participation from the panelists, the audience, and look forward to the final day of IPF tomorrow with some great sessions. Thank you.